the government's response to the Gender Recognition Act 2004's consultation, as outlined in the Government Equalities Office update of September the 22nd.
Secretary of State Liz Truss.
Mr. Speaker, we want transgender people to be free to live and prosper in modern Britain. We've looked carefully at the issues raised in the consultation, including potential changes to the Gender Recognition Act 2004. It is the government's view that the balance struck in this legislation is correct, in that there are proper checks and balances in the system and also support for people who want to change their legal sex. We will make the gender recognition certificate process kinder and more straightforward. We will cut bureaucracy by enabling applications via gov.uk, and we will also reduce the fee from £140 to a nominal amount. We know from our research that improving healthcare support is the priority for transgender people. That's why we're opening at least 3 new gender clinics this year, which should see waiting lists cut by 1,600 patients by 2022. And it's why the GEO is providing funding for Dr. Michael Brady, the UK's national LGBT health advisor, and working with him and the NHS to improve transgender people's experience. It's also important that we protect single-sex spaces in line with the Equality Act. The law is clear that service providers are able to restrict access to single-sex spaces on the basis of biological sex. It's also important that under-18s are properly supported in line with their age and decision-making capabilities. That is why Dr. Hilary Cass, former President of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, will lead an independent review into gender identity services for children and young people. This review will look to make sure young people get the best possible support and expertise throughout their care, and it will report back next year. Mr. Speaker, together this upholds the rights of transgender people and women, ensures that our system is kinder and more straightforward, and addresses the concerns of transgender people.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for enabling the government's overdue response to this consultation to be questioned by colleagues here so promptly. This issue is of first-order importance to between 2 and perhaps 500,000 of our fellow citizens and their families. Perhaps my right honourable friend could begin her reply by giving her analysis of why so many trans people choose to hide in plain sight. I welcome and enjoy the dynamism of my right honourable friend that she brings to her unprecedented historic responsibilities in retaking control of British trade policy after nearly half a century. The command of technical, economic and legal detail required are both at once intimidating and inspiring. As a great trading nation, it needs all her attention, and she has risen to the trade challenge. Her acquisition of the Equalities brief in September 2019 was hardly planned. The Prime Minister has done her and the nation no favours by continuing to overburden her after the election at such an extraordinary time for trade. The contrast in her reputation between each responsibility is horribly stark, and on women and equalities, horribly stark, set against the reputation and achievement of our right honourable friend for Portsmouth South. It was in her tenure when we created the expectations that we were finally going to deliver on equality for trans people in principle, based on a comprehensive consultation, itself based on work under the coalition going back to 2011. Does my right honourable friend understand the crashing disappointment of trans people with the content of her statement on Tuesday when set against the consultation on which it was based? Does she appreciate that trans people cannot discern any strong or coherent reason for this screeching change of direction? They are aware of the fear being used against them and fears void of evidence to sustain them. Does she understand the anger at the prospect of their receiving their fundamental rights being snatched away? The longer this uncertainty has been allowed to continue, the worse the fear and anger have become. Does she understand the delay in this statement has helped contribute to that? Does she see that the underlying trend of the majority of people in this country is following the path set by a change of attitude in society a generation earlier towards those with different sexualities? This time, despite the complexities of understanding around trans, Younger people in particular are more starkly intolerant of the cruelty of wider society's inhumanity towards trans people. And the vast majority of LGBT people will stand in solidarity with trans people. Does she appreciate that her statement does not command a majority in this House? And will she confirm that is one of the reasons she is unable to propose any legislation? She has presented the House with an inherently unstable settlement that will have to be addressed, hopefully sooner rather than later. Does she understand that the preemptive statement she made to the Select Committee earlier this year, when it was properly explained to me, was the moment and gave it my full attention and that of the APPG for Global LGBT Rights? I engaged, Mr. Speaker, with people who had different views on this issue to understand the compromises necessary to deliver the reassurance around trans people, but also to be able to deliver trans right. That work was done. It was given quietly in a comprehensive paper to the government in early July, and tragically, it has been ignored.
How long was it?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I believe that the settlement we have reached balances the rights and upholds the rights of transgender people and of women. It protects access to single-sex spaces. And as I noted in my statement earlier, the number one concern of transgender people is improving healthcare services. The new clinics that we are putting in place will be the first new clinics put in place in the United Kingdom for 20 years. We're also addressing people's main concerns with the Gender Recognition Certificate process, namely the cost and bureaucracy. I believe that we have come to the right conclusion, which is in line with other major nations.
We're now heading to Battersea to Shadow Minister Marcia de Cordova. Marcia?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for granting this urgent question. After 3 years of toxic debate, it is deeply disappointing that this government has let trans people down and dropped its plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act. The debate around reform of the Act has been intensely fought and has caused great harm to many. Trans people face daily discrimination, and the average wait for a first appointment with a gender clinic is 18 months. So it is vital that steps are taken to tackle discrimination and provide the services and the support that people need. The delay in responding to this consultation is completely unacceptable. So can the Minister tell us why it took so long? She failed to answer my question yesterday on whether the 3 new clinics mentioned in her statement were new, and we now know that they are not. So what steps will the government be taking to radically reduce the waiting times for people to access gender clinics? What will the Minister do to ensure that all public bodies, including the Government Equalities Office and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, produce statutory guidance which is in keeping with the legislation? The government will make changes to the admin process for obtaining a gender recognition certificate. So can the Minister tell us what the new online process will look like? What will the new fee be, and when will it come into force? What is the timeline for when this new process will go live? And will the Minister commit to ensuring she will engage with stakeholders in developing this new process? And what steps will she be taking to tackle the rise in transphobia and misogyny? Labour is committed to the equality and inclusion for trans people and will continue to support updating the GRA to include self-declaration for trans people. We are also proud to be the party of the Equality Act, and we will uphold it, not least because it plays a vital role in ensuring that we are an inclusive society.
Secretary Truss.
I can assure the Honourable Lady that I have brought this decision forward as much as I was able to do, given that it is a complex issue that we needed to thoroughly examine. I feel where we have got to is the right place, that maintains the rights of transgender people, improves the process to make it kinder and more straightforward, at the same time as protecting single-sex spaces. The Honourable Lady asked about healthcare. I agree that's a priority. That's why we are opening the first new gender identity clinics for the first time in 20 years. And we're committed to making sure that transgender healthcare is improved and waiting lists are reduced. We've funded Dr. Michael Brady, our LGBT health advisor. There is definitely more work that needs to be done to make sure that services operate fully right across the country and across the National Health Service. And of course, I'm working very closely with the Health Secretary on that. The Honourable Lady has answered when the new fee arrangements and the new online arrangements will come into place. The answer is we will be doing that as soon as possible. Obviously, it's an IT process we need to get online, but I aim to introduce the new fee, which will be nominal, as soon as possible.
Sean Bailey.
Mr. Speaker, many of the trans community that I represent feel very locked out of the healthcare system at the moment. I welcome very much the comments that my right honourable friend has made about focus on healthcare, but couldn't she just assure the trans community that I represent that we will truly look at ensuring that the healthcare is accessible, because for many this is an issue that has gone on for far too long.
Well, I completely agree with my honourable friend. There aren't enough services. That's why we're introducing new clinics. There are also an issue with support for the under 18s, which is why the NHS has launched the CAS review yesterday. We are taking this issue seriously. Of course, I welcome the reduction in the waiting list, but of course there is more to be done, and we need to work closely with the Health Department to achieve that.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Anne McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes people are opposed to the human rights of others in case it encroaches on theirs. It's an almost instinctive human reaction. So when we as politicians want to ensure those human rights, it's not just about actions, but about language and about educating so that we all understand each other and we're all in a place where we're happy for others who we don't necessarily identify with to have equal access to human rights and opportunities. That said, action is crucial. And this week, I'm sorry to say, the Minister has failed on that front. I'm sorry to say it because her language in the past has indicated better than this. And I'm sorry she's failed to take action because of the impact on the many trans people who have written to me from across the UK very distressed. The fact remains that trans people continue to suffer poorer outcomes relative to the wider population, and this needs to change. We're now at a stage in terms of equality where the language we use around race, gender and disability, whilst not perfect, is getting there. Actions have been taken, laws have been written. We need more compliance and more enforcement, but at least the laws exist. Now, this is a devolved matter, and yes, it is complex, but it's not too complex for the Scottish Government, which continues to have a strong commitment to reform the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland before next May's elections in 2021. There are many reasons for this. One reason is everyone surely has the right to be who they are, but also we need to recognise, or we do recognise, that we must comply with international human rights law, and the way to do that is to have a system for obtaining legal gender recognition. So my question for the Minister is, does the Minister and her government recognise the need to comply with international human rights law? Do they care about it? And secondly, the Gender Recognition Panel takes applications from across the UK, and the Scottish Government will obviously carefully consider what she said and what that means for Scotland, but will she commit to cooperating with the Scottish Government?
I'm very interested in what the Honourable Lady has said, because my understanding was the Scottish Government's draft bill to reform the GRA has been paused. So I'd be very happy to take it up with her at a later opportunity. In terms of human rights law, of course we're very committed to that, and we continue to lead the world in LGBT rights and human rights, and will shortly be hosting an international LGBT conference.
Sarah Bretliff.
Does my right honourable friend agree that it's important to reflect on the need to treat members of the trans community with kindness and respect, and to find a way to make paths to self-determination not just cheaper but easier?
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and it's very important that we address the issues that transgender people have had with the process, namely the cost and the bureaucracy, and we don't want finance to be a barrier to people to be able to go through the GRC process.
Heading to Wheeling with James Murray. James Murray.
Mr. Speaker, it's been well over 2 years since the government first sought views on how to reform the Gender Recognition Act. Their consultation received over 100,000 responses, the vast majority of which were in favour of reform. Yet the truth is the government has chosen to change little about the process of acquiring a gender recognition certificate. They've chosen to leave in place a lengthy and medicalised process that requires medical reports, statutory declarations, consideration by a panel, and more. So why has the government taken so long to respond, only to ignore the wishes and destroy the hopes of so many in the trans community?
Secretary Truss.
Well, as I made clear earlier, the government does not believe in moving towards a model of self-ID. This is a serious process that has taken time for us to consider, but our view is that we need to maintain proper checks and balances in the system. What we have done is address the issues that transgender people highlighted as important to them around healthcare, the bureaucracy and the costs of the process, making the process kinder and more straightforward.
Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to thank the Right Honourable Lady for her engagement with myself and others on this issue today. I know the community are feeling frustrated by the lack of substance in the conclusion to this very lengthy consultation, notwithstanding the very valid point she makes about reform to healthcare response. Will she acknowledge these changes are menial, with current waiting lists of well over 13,000 people pre-COVID? Mr. Speaker, this is a great concern when research shows 84% of trans people have thought about suicide, with 50% attempting it. Will she commit to further working with myself and others who care passionately that the government gets this right? And will she report back to us on her work with colleagues in the Department for Health on the progress that she makes?
Yeah.
Well, I certainly agree with my honourable friend that healthcare is the big issue of concern to transgender people, and that is why we are focusing on improving the service received from the National Health Service. Now, of course, it's the Health Secretary who's overall in charge of that, and I'd be very happy to facilitate further meetings with Dr. Michael Brady, our LGBT health advisor, and of course the Health Department, to make sure we get this right and we do reduce those waiting lists.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I welcome that the Secretary of State has tried to take some of the heat out of this discussion and has at least come forward with some conclusions, because the waiting has caused many of the problems. But I fail to see how her administrative changes will comply with the World Health Organization's requirement that by 2020 we remove gender dysphoria as a medical classification, seeing that the GRA is based on that medical classification. Can she tell me how her administrative changes fulfil our international obligations to remove that classification?
Secretary Truss.
The administrative changes we're making will make the process considerably better. And as I've said, we're also putting additional resources into transgender service. In terms of the clinical diagnosis, that is a matter for clinicians, and I know the Health Secretary is working with clinicians on this issue. I do think there does need to be a medical element to the process, so there are proper checks and balances in the system, but in terms of the specific diagnosis, that really is a matter for clinicians.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am proud to be in this House as the first openly LGBT person representing Carshalton and Wallington. And I do stand with my local trans community in saying that their rights are human rights. These reforms are a welcome first step, particularly around health. But it does need to go further. So what assurances can my right honourable friend give to me that this is indeed the first step? This is not the end of what we're going to be doing for trans people in this country. Bring the UK into line with countries like Argentina and Ireland, and to make those changes that cost so little but mean so much to the lives of trans people.
Well, thank you very much. I would point out to my honourable friend, on this issue we are in line with the vast majority of major European countries, and we are working through our international LGBT conference to improve the rights of LGBT people across the world, and I'm very proud of the leadership we've shown as a country in areas like equal marriage and other issues of LGBT rights. It's important to note, though, that whilst we do want to improve healthcare services, and I'm committed to working with the Department of Health on this, we don't believe in moving to a model of self-ID. We do believe that the system does need proper checks and balances.
But the problem, Mr. Speaker, is that she has not shown leadership on this issue. The decision is wrong, the delay has been wrong, and the hurt caused to the trans community, to the non-binary community as well, is wrong. That's what my constituents are telling me. She's heard the concern across the House. Does she understand the hurt? These are human beings, our fellow human beings at the heart of this, who are feeling deeply distressed, deeply let down, and deeply concerned at the direction in which this government is going. And will she stop the off-the-record briefing of newspapers whipping up hatred against the trans non-binary community?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman that there has not been a single off-the-record briefing coming from me. Well, I don't appreciate the honourable gentleman's tone. I'm being genuine and honest, and I'm seeking to make this process kinder and more straightforward, and I don't think levelling accusations like that as me is helpful.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank you for granting this urgent question, because it is very important that this Parliament demonstrates that it represents everybody in the United Kingdom. And I want again to reiterate my solidarity with the trans community. Can I ask my right honourable friend just to clarify again the situation in relation to the 3 new clinics, as was implied by her statement on Tuesday? Are they new clinics in addition to the pilot projects previously announced? And in terms of their work, will she take on board the points raised by my right honourable friend from West Bromwich East in terms of a number of 1,600 against the ever-growing waiting list?
So these clinics are new. As to whether they are pilot clinics previously announced, that's really something that the Health Department are the experts on, but they are new clinics and they will reduce the waiting list. Now, clearly, it will not reduce the waiting list to the extent that we need that to happen. That's why we're working with the Department of Health on what more can be done. But I agree with my honourable friend, we don't want people to have to wait for this important treatment.
On the 13th of July, Baroness Barker's office submitted a Freedom of Information request of details of who the Secretary of State had met with regards to the Gender Recognition Act, and to date there has been no answer. So can she now confirm who she has met personally, whether she has met personally with trans-led organisations and trans people, before making this important decision, which ignores the views and recommendation of a clear majority of those who responded to the consultation?
Well, I can assure the honourable lady that I and the GEO have met with a wide variety of organisations. We've met 140 representative organisations, including LGBT and women's organisations. I've also met a number of parliamentary colleagues to discuss this issue.
Heading up to the North East with Peter Gibson. Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a strong trans community in Darlington who are valued and appreciated by their employers. Over 200 company leaders have written to the Prime Minister in respect of trans rights. Can I ask my right honourable friend what assessment she has made of the compatibility of the government's position on trans rights and those of corporate Britain?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I've laid out the government's position on transgender rights in terms of making sure we protect those rights, making the process kinder and more straightforward in improving transgender healthcare services. In terms of what corporates' views are, that's a matter for them rather than the government.
14 withdrawn. Felicity Bucket.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the very measured and conciliatory tone that you have taken today. I welcome the improvements to transgender health services and also the protection of vulnerable women in terms of the retention of single-sex spaces in places like domestic abuse shelters. Can my right honourable friend outline the government's approach to women's prisons?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. She is right. Under the Equality Act, service providers can restrict entry on the basis of biological sex. And of course, there are cases like women's refuges and prisons where that is an important issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has taken nearly 3 years for the government to respond to this consultation, and in that time the trans community have had their hopes raised and now dashed. If my inbox is reflective of other members in this House, the trans community feel bitterly let down by the government's actions this week. This has to be seen in a context of rising hate crimes, and the government's response, and I will pull the Minister up on this, the government's response is not in line with what other nations are doing. We can look to Argentina, we can look to the Republic of Ireland, our near neighbour, who are doing things very, very different. In the Republic of Ireland, they've got a demedicalised, self-determined system for gender recognition since 2015, and it's working. So can I urge the Minister for Women and Equalities to look again and to not let down the trans community, who are some of the most vulnerable constituents that we represent in this House.
In the statement I laid out earlier, I outlined the work we're doing to improve transgender healthcare. And in all the research work and engagement we've done, that comes out as the #1 issue for transgender people. And I think as a country, focusing on that, improving the healthcare services, is the way to help people lead better lives.
My right honourable friend's statement will make it easier for people to be who they want to be whilst maintaining the integrity of the Equalities Act. But could I just ask her again, because many women have felt anxious during this process, will she reconfirm her support for single-sex spaces where reasonable?
Well, my honourable friend is right that we are striking a balance between the rights of transgender people and the rights of women. The position is clear in the Equality Act that service providers can restrict the use of spaces on the basis of biological sex. And it's important that women's spaces, which have been hard fought for over generations, are protected.
Heading up to Greater Manchester, to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In her written statement on Tuesday, the Minister stated that she wanted transgender people to be free to live and to prosper in a modern Britain. But between 2013-14 and 2017-18, recorded anti-trans hate crimes nearly trebled. What steps is she and her government taking to tackle this discrimination, this abuse and the hate crimes that many trans people experience?
Well, these crimes are absolutely appalling, and that is why the Home Office is taking very strong action to address this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the announcement that my right honourable friend's statement made earlier this week, and I echo my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, that this, whilst it is a very important step, it cannot be the destination. It can only be that step in a long journey. Will my right honourable friend agree that under 18s should receive specialist support, and can she outline some of those measures that will be taken?
My honourable friend is right that under 18s do need specialist support. That's why Dr. Hilary Cass, the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, has been appointed to lead an independent review into gender identity services for children and young people. It will be wide-ranging, looking at the referral route to specialist services, assessment and diagnosis, as well as best practice for services.
Final question from Stuart Seymour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite a few crumbs of comfort, fundamentally the government is sticking with a process that the Women and Equalities Committee quite rightly said runs contrary to the dignity and personal autonomy of applicants. So instead of describing that as checks and balances, will she recognise that in actual fact it's a breach of human rights and the government should think again?
As I've said, we want to make the process kinder, we want to make it more straightforward. That's why we're reducing the bureaucracy, putting it online, as well as reducing the fee, so finance isn't a barrier for people being able to access those services. But I think the most important thing we're doing is improving the level of service available within the National Health Service, so more people are seen more quickly.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order.